to dive in today. And what are we going to dive in on? We're going to talk about economic uncertainty and the possibility of recession. I want to be super clear that this is not financial advice. We are not perfect predictors and prognosticators of the economy. If we were, we'd probably have a different job. But instead, we're really going to dive in on how might you as a nonprofit make the most of potential economic uncertainty or a recession. And we'll talk about some really specific tactics on how to do that. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. This event, like most of them, is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. At the end of the session, we will add a survey in the chat and just make a quick note, and that will certify your participation. There's no official email or thing that we send to you, but just make a note there, and that's good. And then we'll back you up if you get audited. So that's the process there. If you don't know what CFRE is, don't worry about it, but it is a certification for professional fundraisers. Here's the agenda for today. I won't read it out. The most important thing to know is that the recording and the slides will be sent around later today. And so we'll pass that along to you. All right, so some very quick intros before we get started. My name is Patrick. I've met a ton of you in person, a ton of you virtually. I'm lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO alongside my dear friend, Jenny, pictured here. And we're really lucky to be part of just a wonderful, amazing, diverse team that we're really grateful to get to work with on a day in, day out basis. And so we've raised a little under $8 billion for charities to date. We work with a little bit under 1,200 nonprofit partners, hopefully crossing 1,200 this month, I think. And just feel really fortunate to be part of this group. So one other thing, we feel really fortunate that you're here, and we love saying thank you for you taking some time to learn, to stretch yourself, to join us, oftentimes to contribute in the chat. And so we are giving away a book to 20 folks. We gave this away a couple months ago, and people loved it. So it's a book called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Make a note at the end of the session. We'll drop a survey in the chat. Same thing with the CFRE, and give us your address. But it's a really fascinating book about how people think about money and how you probably think about money. And so it's really helpful for our fundraising. It's really helpful for our professional careers. It's also helpful as you think about, how do I save? How do I figure out how big a house to buy when I get there? How do I think about what kind of spending is going to make me happy and what kind of spending is not going to make me happy, based on a bunch of actual research. And so I find this book, I probably read it in about 2 hours. It's a really quick read. It's really fun. It's really, really interesting. It's sort of a good reflection. Money obviously is such an incredible part of our world, and an important part for both good and bad. And so it's really fun to check it out. So take a look at that. And if you don't get it, it might be worth a buy on Amazon. So we asked how your week is going. You can see a little bit less happy. Interestingly, eagerness sort of pumped up a bunch. A little bit more anxious, but not a lot compared to 2 weeks ago. And you can see things are relatively even. So this is what your peers are feeling right now, and it's worth sort of checking in on. But then separately, when we asked you how confident you are in meeting your goals this year, this is where we took a little dip. Not quite as low as in last year, but I don't know if it's the topic of the webinar that's driving people down. But if folks have a sense of why this shift from the last 2 weeks, we really would love to hear it. Would love to hear your input, and so feel free to make a note in the chat if you have opinions on why that might be. We also asked you, by the way, in the event of an economic downturn, how confident are you personally in the diversity of your fundraising revenue streams to sustain your organization? Or are you confident? And about a third said, yeah, we're pretty confident. We have a good plan. But almost a third said no. And then a bunch of folks said, I'm not sure, right? So I'm not sure was the biggest. And so what our goal for the next 45 minutes or so is let's take out some of that uncertainty, and let's try to help some of the no folks come up with a couple strategies that would shift them to yes, and hopefully the yes folks get even more confident, right? So that's the goal of our next 40 minutes. Fundraising landscape in 2023. We'll talk about this in 1 second. I did want to make a really quick note before we dive in here. 2 weeks ago, we did this really, really interesting webinar on the future of artificial intelligence in philanthropy. If you haven't gotten a chance to watch it, go check it out. It's on our sort of nonprofits webinar page. But a ton of you emailed me since then to say, I hadn't tried anything, I hadn't checked this out, and I just started using it. And boy, I was really surprised with the results and really excited by it. So I just want to say thank you to all the folks that came to the session, went and tried it out, learned a bunch of stuff, and then shared it with us. So I really just wanted to say thank you to those folks. And hopefully this session is as helpful as that one. So great to hear from all of you on that. All right, so we're going to talk about for 3 minutes on the broader economic landscape, and then we'll talk about what it means for giving, and then we'll talk about what to do about it. And so when we talk about a recession, it's sort of important to actually just define some of our terms first. And economists typically use this term, a recession, to mean 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining national GDP, right? And this is inflation adjusted. Economists predict that there's a 70% chance the US will suffer a recession in 2023. So it might not happen, may happen, we'll see. What does a recession look like day to day? Well, usually it means a lot of less spending from consumers, which increases unemployment, right? There's less being spent, and therefore there's less to spend on wages. It would be an increase in unemployment, which we should note is currently at historic lows, right? We're at sort of the highest employment that America has seen since the 40s, when the government was paying everybody to build armaments for World War II, right? And so, I mean, really just a stunning accomplishment as a national economy to be this low, but we could see that uptick. You'd also see a decline in business investments. That seems to be happening already. And a decline in the value of assets, often things like real estate or stocks, right? So these things could all happen, may or may not, but these are what we'd start looking at for a recession. Not all of these have to happen in order for what we call the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, to declare a recession. But it's normally triggered by external events, financial crisis, global events, natural disasters, right? These all flow into it. And since World War II, the average recession actually lasts only around 10 months. Now, if you go back before World War II, which is a little bit less relevant for our purposes, it lasts about 14 to 18 months. Why is that? We weren't as good at fiscal policy before that, right? So things like the Fed didn't really have the tools they have now to help control the economy. And so you have actually shorter recessions in the last, call it 80 years, which is a pretty big accomplishment as you think about what government does. There have been 3 recessions since 2000. The dot-com bubble burst in 2001, the Great Recession, and then the COVID-19 recession, which ended up being a lot shorter than most, right? So you can see, 8 years between one, 13 years between the next. Obviously, that was a little bit short-lived and it was less economic driven. And now, potentially one in 2023 or 2024. So what are some warning signs? How do we know this might be coming? Well, a decline in consumer confidence is one. If surveys show a sustained drop in how confident consumers are, that could be a sign of trouble. So that's something we're keeping an eye on. We'll keep you updated on it. Something called the Leading Economic Index, which looks at things like applications for unemployment insurance, new orders for manufacturing, stock market performance, things that are looking at how people expect the economy to be in a couple months or in a couple quarters. Other things we look at: sudden stock market declines, investors who are selling part or all of their holdings. We look at rising unemployment. Haven't seen that yet, but just a few months of steep job losses would be a big warning. We also look at an inverted yield curve, which I'll talk about for just a second, because it turns out to be one of the best predictors of recession, even though it's a little wonky. So what's an inverted yield curve? It's a graph that plots the market value of government bonds, short-term bonds and long-term bonds, right? Short-term, we mean, you invest in it now and it pays you back in 3 months. Long-term, you invest now, it pays you back in 10 years. And normally what happens is interest rates are higher on long-term bonds. The government or whoever's borrowing says, it must be tough to have all that money locked up for a decade. Therefore, I'm going to pay you more than if you just lock it up for 3 months. And I don't mean in total, I mean on a month-by-month or year-by-year basis. But what's happening in yield curve inversions are when the long-term yields, meaning the interest rates on a long-term bond, is lower than the short-term bond. Because basically what that means is investors say, look, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the near future, but we expect things to be better in the long term. And so an inverted yield curve, right? That's why we're talking about this, why we're getting super wonky about bond interest rates on a call with nonprofit fundraisers, is this has actually predicted every recession since 1969. Now, it's not a guarantee, but it's certainly been the case. So are we or aren't we? Are we going into a recession or are we not? Again, we don't have a crystal ball here. But what we're seeing here is there's been a lot of major instability over the past several months. Global growth is projected to fall from 3.5% to about 3% to 2023. It's a pretty meaningful decline, even though it doesn't look that way. And inflation rates remain higher than pre-pandemic levels. So all of these factors are happening. You can see here what inflation looks like, and look how much it jumped up in 2021, right? We had relatively low inflation year over year over year, and the whole economy and the government got used to this. And then we went back to 1970s era levels of inflation, 7%, 6.5%, 6%, but you can see it trending down, right? So what folks expect here is more tightening, through 2024, trying to push those interest rates down, trying to push inflation down primarily, and that should help the economy open back up. Now, the other thing that many of you would have read about, and we felt super acutely at FreeWill because we had not all, but most of our money in Silicon Valley Bank, is that the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank in March caused economists to increase their predictions of a recession to hit this year. SVB collapsed on March 10th. It was honestly one of the scariest days of my professional life due to a lack of diversification and a bank run days before the collapse. And it was the biggest bank failure since Washington Mutual in September of 2008. So you can imagine how scary it was having not seen a bank run for 15 years to have it happen to your bank. But thankfully, my co-founder, Jenny, who you met earlier in the session, a bunch of our folks on our team moved super quickly and were able to be totally good. So a bunch of you reached out with your concern, and we appreciate that along the way. But this might be different from previous recessions. And so we just want to talk about this for a second before we get more into what it means for philanthropy. And experts are predicting what we call a slow recession, not a crash, meaning there's time to repair and there's time to sort of help us think about our strategies, as opposed to the 2008 crash, which happened super quickly, 2001 crash, which happened super quickly, 2020 COVID crash, super fast, as you remember. And in fact, the S&P is actually up, right? The S&P is a major stock index, and it's up 7% after being down last year. Now, part of this might, investors might say, yeah, we think there's a recession coming up, but we anticipate a quick recovery. So we want to get in on these bargain prices right now. The Fed is expected to continue to raise interest rates, as we talked about, to combat inflation, and then possibly and probably lowering them next year, right? All right. So quick summary here. Economists have been predicting a recession for a while now. We're still not there, so they could be wrong. We should still be aware of the economic climate because it's going to affect our work, right? Our work is very focused on getting people to give away money, which obviously matters how much money there is and how these people are feeling about their own finances. We might see months of similar news stories before we officially enter a recession. So you want to start being proactive, right? When the official declaration of a recession is often backwards looking. You've already been through those 2 quarters of downward GDP. And so people are going to feel it before that happens. Sue says there have been many bank failures. That's correct, Sue. This is the largest since 2008. All right, so let's prepare for an economic downturn. Let's talk about what this means for philanthropy, right? First is to understand that donors prioritize what's important to them. In 2008 and 2009, giving fell by a total of 15%, right? This is the most acute recession of the last 30 years. But giving to nonprofits such as foods, banks, and essential services actually grew by 10%. Individual motivations for charity go far beyond finances, involve personal values. And what it means here, and we're going to talk about this for the rest of the session, is that there's actually a path not just to surviving a recession, but to thriving through a recession. And we'll talk about how that works. In a recession, again, we don't know we'll be in one, but just in case, percentage of income given to charity actually stays fairly consistent. Americans spend most of their money on housing, transport, food, but despite this, there's not a huge shift in how much we're spending on each thing. It just sort of all goes down a little bit when income goes down. Average income donated to charity ranges from 3% to 5% of annual gross income, fluctuates a bit, not necessarily based on economic factors. So as we think about this for our jobs, right, as nonprofit fundraisers, we see, first, total giving has grown on an average annual rate by 3.3%. During years of economic growth, it grows by almost 5%. And during economic downturns, it decreases by about 0.5%. Now, this is really good. I mean, we don't get to sort of congratulate you all as a sector a lot, But the fact that it goes down just a little bit in the down years and goes up by a lot more in the up years shows incredible progress across the sector, right? Great Recession, by far the worst time for giving, dropped by 7.4%, another 8%. That is highly abnormal, but it's the worst it's seen. And you can see here, I mean, take a look at this, right? So the most important thing is this line graph, not these dots, right? The dots are total dollars, but that they're not inflation adjusted. So you can't really compare $100 in 1986 to $100 in 2022. But look at this inflation adjusted numbers and look at how much it's gone up year over year over year and decade over decade. I mean, this is an enormous kudos to you and your colleagues and your predecessors who actually just radically increased giving in the United States, right? And so what I believe that these numbers, by the way, are similar in Canada. I know a bunch of folks here from Canada. I don't have numbers from Australia, Japan, and South Africa, where I also know there are folks on the call from, but you might want to look at those for your own country. You can see in recession years, right? I mean, 2008, 2009, the middle of that, that's really where we're dropping off. But for the most part, you look at 90, 91, 79, 80, 82, you look at 2020, and not the huge downturn you'd see, right? This is really, really promising and pretty exciting for us as a sector that things don't drop as much as you might consider. If you look at things like, spending on fancy vacations, you'd see a much bigger drop, right? So really nice that Americans and people really prioritize giving even in hard times, and that you as a sector have done just an incredible job to push this upwards. When we look at sort of year over year change, it gives us a little bit more of a clear picture. You can see obviously 2008, just the worst, right? Really difficult time for everybody, but you can see how much that grows year over year, et cetera. So pretty good to see there. So what else can we expect? Well, economic downturns can make it more difficult to raise funds, but there's no evidence that inflation influences donors' desire to give one way or another. But inflation can, and this is really important, it can reduce the purchasing power of the donations, which will make it harder for you to achieve your impact goals, right? So there's a world where you set out and you set your ambitious fundraising goals and you hit them, but then you can't buy all the things you expected to buy with that money because of inflation, and actually you're not able to have the impact you need, right? So for us, we need to not just hit our goals in these times, but also make sure that we're exceeding them as much as possible, because we're not sure what of our expenses are going to go up, either staffing or oftentimes, durable goods, food, healthcare, depending on your own efforts, right? We also might see things like lower wages or general instability, increased cost of living. All of this could affect donors' ability to give. So let's talk now. Let's dive in a little bit here on what do we do during a recession, right? How do we actually not just hit the goals we hit in 2021, but surpass them? And then we're going to talk about a couple of different things. First is we're going to make the most of new donor psychographics. For the next 12 months, the economic downturn and the recession are likely to be the dominant news story, along with the Republican presidential primary, a potential Trump trial, also other big stories, right? The rise of AI. We'll see the continued work and the continued conflict in Ukraine, potentially other issues. But this is going to be a dominant story, not just in sort of the New York Times, Washington Post, but on morning shows, on radio talk, on social media, right? You'll see a lot of things like, how to stretch your dollar, how to make money go even further, like, at-home hacks to save money, things like that. And so this message is going to continuously be repeated to your donors, mostly not by you, right? Mostly by the folks spending billions of dollars in advertising and the news media, right? Not saying it's bad, it's just very likely to happen. And as you consume media over the next week, right, especially that with commercials and advertising or news, start paying attention to how people are framing the economy. What you'll often hear, and I watch, one of my guilty pleasures is watching baseball after sort of hard day's work, and typically tune into the New York Mets broadcast, who are, not having quite the start we hope for this year. But you'll see things like advertisements for pickup trucks, and they'll say, now more than ever is the time to be smart with your money. And that's why you should run to your local Dodge dealer for $3,000 cash back and no interest financing, right? And they frame the purchase as being economically savvy. And these messages are hitting all of your donors constantly and will be for the year. Donors will see hundreds of how to be smart with their money articles and news stories and all these things. And so we're going to use this to hit our goals, right? One of my favorite sayings is, you can't change the wind, but you can tilt your sails. And so we're going to capture some of the energy from all of this sort of macro environment news and discussion and content in order to hit our goals. So let's talk about how to do that. When we talk about giving, more so than in 2019 or in 2021, we got to start talking about things that are tax smart, or smarter ways to give, or savvy ways to give, or ways to give that can save you more money than cash, right? And there are two big categories here. The first is appreciated assets. We're going to talk primarily about stock here and crypto, because these gifts avoid capital gains taxes and typically get a full federal income tax deduction, and often a state deduction depending on where you live. So it's just cheaper to give this than it is to give cash, or you have more impact for the same amount of money, right? These kinds of messages are really potent with your donors. The second are gifts like qualified charitable distributions. There's a typo here, it should say distributions, for older donors, or workplace deductions that give you pre-tax money, right? I mean, these are another way to avoid taxes and help save or give more for the same cost to you, right? And the good news for us is it's a huge win for the donors, but these gifts also tend to be way bigger for you. And so it's a win-win, right? This is one of the first ways that we can thrive through a downturn. And one more note here. Some of you have been to our writing session, which we'll probably do again in a few months because people love it. And one of the really interesting research points we saw is that framing something as exceptional, and this could be unprecedented need during a recession, changes how people mentally budget the expense, right? And so one of the most important things here is that we're removing this comparison to regular disposable income and increases charitable giving. Just to give you a little bit more on this sort of exceptional versus ordinary, some of the research shows that if you say, we're doing our annual drive, you'll get less money than if you say, we're doing our drive that happens only once a year. Now, those mean exactly the same thing, but one of it sounds like, oh, it's consistent, it's going to be an ongoing expense for me. And one of it says it's a special occasion. Now, many of you will have been out to eat in the last 3-4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. And one thing that you'll hear a lot more than you did a couple years ago, is people saying, oh, is it a special occasion? Oh, are you celebrating something? Now, why do they do that? Are they going to bring a cake that says happy graduation? No. What they're doing is, once they've put you in the position of thinking, oh yeah, this is a special occasion. Oh, it's a special date night that we don't do a lot. Oh, it's a graduation party. Oh, I just got a new job. Well, then suddenly we're ordering dessert. We're ordering that bottle of wine that maybe we wouldn't normally do, because we're taking it out of the ordinary, right? So next time you're at a restaurant, listen for that, and then think about how do we use that in our own fundraising. Remember that food banks and other organizations saw an increase during the Great Recession. And so when we talk about these things as special, emergency, one time, this really adds a ton of value for our giving. All right, so that's our first point, right? We are highlighting the now more than ever, this is special just once a year, right? And we're really talking about this tax savviness, right? We are here to help you save money in your giving, right? That's a fundamentally different way than you normally talk about it, but we're going to start doing that. The second thing, right, this still plays with psychographics, is that our anchor points become even more important, right? So let's talk about these. There are a couple of potential anchor points, and there are 3 that you probably use in your own time right now. The first one is, how much does it cost me? The second is, how much am I saving? And the third is, what impact am I having? And so we're going to start thinking about, in each ask, what are we doing, right? We want to stay away from the first one when we're asking folks for money, and we'll use the second and the third, or both of those. And this is always true, right? So recessions are a really good time because you have to hone your skills, and it will make you even more successful in other periods. Let's take a look at what this means. So here's one example, right? This is the worst way to frame an ask. Can you give $10,000 this year to the land trust? Now, why is this bad, right? Maybe it works, right? It's not going to never work. But what I'm doing as the donor now is I'm saying, ooh, $10,000. And I think about the other things I could spend on $10,000. Maybe that's a semester of private school. I don't really know how much private school costs these days. Maybe that's, 3 months of mortgage payments. Maybe that's a month of salary or 2 months of salary or 2 weeks of salary, depending on who you are. Right? So, and I'm really just thinking, what else could I be getting for that? Now, another version, right, this sort of framing too is, did you know that by giving a gift of $10,000 in appreciated stock, you might be able to save more than $5,000 in taxes this year, right? We're targeting that capital gains and the income tax deduction. And now, wow, suddenly saving $5,000 feels pretty good. That's a big deal. And you can see, you can see how much bigger that gift might be compared to the first one, or how much more likely you are to be successful, right? So let's sort of imagine what that might look like in your own work. Alexis's private school is $30K. I don't have kids yet, so I don't know how much these things cost, but my condolences to you for spending $30K on private school if you are. But here's the third anchor point, right? With a $10,000 gift of appreciated stock, you can help us finally open the path through the preserve, which will give thousands of families a chance to experience nature in a new way next year. And now suddenly, I'm anchoring on, wow, for only $10,000, I can help thousands of families experience nature in a new way. I mean, that's an incredible deal, right? That is like bargain racket, Marshall's level savings in terms of the value I'm going to get for the cost. And if you think about, put yourself in the donor's shoes, how does number one feel? How does number two feel? How does number three feel? And maybe how does, a combination of 2 and 3 feel, right? With a $10,000 gift of appreciated stock, you can finally help us open up the path through the preserve, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, you might actually save $5,000 in taxes. And suddenly I thought this was valuable at $10,000. Now it's really valuable at $5,000. And you can see how this matters, right? So many folks end up doing the first one, and you're getting a lot more no's than you would on that third one. Another reminder, we're anchoring people on their wealth, not their income in tough times. So I've shared this experiment with some of you before, but it's really important, right? There are these grad students, they're positioned outside a grocery store in Boston, and they're asking people at random, what's in your wallet? Cash, credit cards? And they're asking other people, do you own stocks? Do you own bonds? Reminding people of their assets and their wealth. And the shoppers who were asked about their stocks and bonds ended up spending way more at the market than the other folks because they asked for receipts on the way out. Now, nothing changed, right? It's not like they asked the rich people about stocks or the hungry people about stocks, right? This is all sort of random. But when we remind people of their wealth, what we're doing here is just changing the anchor point, which is so important, and suddenly they're able to give a lot more. All right, so that's our first two strategies. Third strategy is, if you have considered getting good as an organization on donor-advised funds, this is the very best time to do so. So nearly 60% of DAF donors intend to give from their donor-advised funds in direct response to crises. This is a really big deal. This money has been pre-given, right? Most of you know how donor-advised funds work. You put money into this sort of shadow account, you get a tax deduction immediately, you can never get it back, right? I can't use this for healthcare spending, for vacations, for food if I'm hungry, never coming back to you. And so what we need to do now is we can talk to our DAF donors about accelerating giving because this money's already out the door. These are the only folks where their interest in giving might not be hurt by a downturn in the economy because they can't get that money back. There's no opportunity cost to them to give this away. And you all know this, right? So we did this whole DAF report published about a month ago, tons of interest, a lot of great feedback. So thank you for everyone who read it and gave us great feedback. And about 70% of you said that DAFs are more important in 2023 compared to last year. 0% said less important, right? Everyone else said, I don't know yet. And then 53% of you said DAFs will be more important during economic downturn. But the other thing is that 0% said it would be less important. right? About half said, I don't know, and half said more important. Because what this is, I am personally incredibly hopeful about this year, even in an economic downturn, and it's because of the way that DAFs are taking over the economy. And I want to show you a couple of things here, right? So at the end of 2021, thank you to NPT for pulling this report together. At the end of 2021, which was a great year for the stock market investments, there was $235 billion sitting in donor advised funds that had not been granted out, right? A 40% increase from the year previous. And what it means here is that money that went in the best of times doesn't always come out in the best of times. And what that is happening is that we're going to smooth out giving between the good years and the bad years. So this could be, people have all sorts of excitement and complaints around donor advised funds. One of the single best things that donor advised funds is going to do is it's going to smooth out giving between recession years and boom years. And this is going to save a lot of impact and save a lot of jobs in the sector during those tougher years. So when we think about DAF grants in 2023 and how we expect it this year, remember that we saw $46 billion in grants from 2021. But the average growth rate year over year in these grants is about 23% over the last 5 years. They're going up and up and up and up. So if we just do some basic math, we would expect $57 billion in grants happened last year and $70 billion in grants happening this year. Now, maybe that's aggressive, or maybe it's conservative, but you could say at least $60 billion is going to happen this year and maybe up to $80 billion. What this means, if we take that 70 billion number, is that 1 out of every $5 in individual giving is going to come from a donor advised fund, right? 20%. And what that means is that there is no serious path to fundraising in 2023 that doesn't have a plan for donor advised funds and that doesn't think about donor advised funds during an economic downturn. We, by the way, would expect this to be even more true in 2024. We don't expect this growth to stop. And so you might see $85, $90 billion given out next year through donor advised funds. And these are just enormous, enormous sums. But the thing is that some of you are very successful getting donor advised fund gifts, and some of you aren't. Organizations that solicited DAFs received $2.2 more in DAFs last year than those that didn't. So this is pretty night and day. And a lot of these organizations that are responding are not that big. So the gap in $100,000 at a million, at a 1 million revenue organization is just enormous. So promoting DAFs is extremely important to your growth. It's building on all the research about how non-cash gifts are actually the thing that fundamentally drives increases in revenue. Okay, so that's our third strategy, and I hope that really sunk in, that this is showtime for your donor advised fund work to a greater degree than it's ever been, because we're in economic uncertain times that are quickly preceded by enormous boom times and the largest growth in donor advised funds that we've ever seen. So this is a really, really big deal. All right, strategy 4, do not let the news fool you. So there is and will be a lot of news about asset prices, about real estate prices, about stocks, about crypto. And a natural reaction is, stock market was down 2% today. It's going to feel weird asking about stock. And that is one of the biggest mistakes that you can make. So here's some historical context for you. Some crypto prices are 1,000% higher than they were 3 years ago, right? 10x increase. Some stocks are up 58% over the past 5 years. I'm sorry, I don't mean some stocks. I mean the entire stock market is up 58% over the past 5 years. I mean, this is the S&P since the beginning of time. And since the beginning of S&P time, not the beginning of prehistory. And if you look at this and you've got a 65-year-old donor, why don't you make a little mental note of when you think that person bought most of their assets? It wasn't in a small window in 2021, it was over this long period of time. And so all of your donors are still going to have appreciated assets, and that's where we get these tax smart ways to give. And so we so often hear nonprofits say, should I still ask about asset giving during these times? And the answer is yes. What we see is these smartest nonprofits continue to do so and thrive, while some other folks are actually falling even farther behind because they're avoiding doing this at the time where they need it most, right? So this is a really important context for you. You want to make sure that your organization, if you're not already, is taking things like stock, crypto, DApps, gifts out of the IRA. As cash becomes less valuable with inflation, these are some of the gifts that are growing and growing. And so we want to turn even more to these in moments of inflation, right? And we want to link to these on our donate page as much as possible. And then here's, we've talked about anchor points. We've talked about the value of these non-cash gifts. And what we see is that there's really like one magic sentence that you should be adding to your normal fundraising emails, right? This is a normal, hey, it's May, it's class day, we're trying to get everyone to chip in, or we're opening the land trust, or we're doing a new campaign at the museum, or we're raising money for our private school, whatever it may be, really think about adding this sentence that you'll see in a second, right? And I'm going to give you a little bit of context on why this sentence is so important. Remember that reminding people of their assets significantly increases how much they're willing to give. And remember that non-cash gifts are much larger than cash gifts from the same people. And so by reminding people, this is really important, reminding people that they can give out of their assets is going to lead you to bigger non-cash gifts, but it also reminds them of their wealth. And so it's going to drive your cash gifts bigger, right? This is a really big deal, because the difference between a $25 cash gift and a $200 cash gift means you can afford, you can have 8 of those gifts just to get that one bigger one. And getting larger gifts from the same people is your number one path to growth, right? If you have a set number of parents, a set number of alumni, a set number of museum members, you're not going to magically triple that. What you are going to do is grow the amount of giving of each gift and from each donor, and this is the pathway to do it. So here's a simple sentence you want to be adding to each of your typical donate emails. You've got your whole email, your setup, et cetera, and then you're going to ask for that donation. And after that, say, remember that many people, right, we're using social proof here, choose to give from their assets, stock, mutual funds, gifts from their IRA, cryptocurrency, grants from their donor advised funds. And just include that in every email you're sending. And what you'll start to see is your average donation is going to go up, and you'll get more of these non-cash gifts, which are really, really, really important, right? So it's a win-win across the board. And remember, your donors are better off because you're helping them save on taxes in a way that wouldn't otherwise be true if they were only giving cash, right? So try this, let us know how it goes. We see a lot of organizations already doing this, but would encourage you to jump on the bandwagon there to be smart about this stuff. Strategy 5, before we get to some questions. Remember that planned giving is non-cyclical, right? For pretty obvious reasons. Planned giving is on a sharp upswing, may more than double over the next few years. Remember that human mortality is almost entirely uncorrelated to economic cycles, right? And so people pass away in good times, in bad times, et cetera. These planned gifts are by far the largest gifts you're ever going to get. And for many people, planned giving allows them to thrive during downtimes and in good times. And so continuing to make sure this is a focus is incredibly important, because some of these gifts are going to be $1 million from folks who previously gave you $20 or $40 or $80, right? Okay, so that is our best advice for how to navigate this. We are going to we're going to drop in a link to a survey. I think my colleague Phoebe is going to do that in the chat. And so please, if you get a moment, thank you so much, Phoebe, fill that out. So a couple of reasons. One, that's where the CFRE credit is, right? So if you haven't done that, please do that as well. 2, that's where the chance to win this book is, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. We're going to send it to 20 folks. Please make sure to add your address so we can actually send it to you. And then 3, it is really, really important to us to get your feedback, to hear what went well, what was useful, where you want more examples, where you want less content. All these things are really useful to us. And so please, please do that. Also, I wanted to invite you for Thursday. So on Thursday, April 13th, which is in 2 days, it's in 47 hours from now, we are going to do a demo of our planned giving tools, which, as you saw earlier, generated well over $7 billion for charity. And in particular, we're going to talk about how people are using the planned giving tools for something called Make a Will Month, which is in August. Make a Will Month is by far the most successful fundraising campaign at a nationwide scale that I've ever seen. mean, it drives enormous giving in terms of commitments and bequests, because what it does is that all of these nonprofits, right, well over 1,000 nonprofits team up to remind people to do their estate planning, and in the process nudge charitable giving. It's an idea that happens a little bit in England to sort of wild success, and some of the English charities basically run, with most of their revenue coming this way. But it's an incredible process, and we'll share a lot more. So we'd love to have you there. One other thing that I wanted to mention, and if you're interested, we can sign you up for a one-on-one demo of this, is that FreeWill has something called the Smart Giving Suite with some pretty awesome technology around donor advised funds, which helps people check out from your donate page through their DAF without ever leaving it. So you can see, I just plug in my fidelity criteria, I pick an amount, I hit continue, it processes, and then suddenly I'm done, right? So it's a 45-second process for giving from someone's donor advised fund from your webpage. It's pretty awesome, and we'd love to show it to you alongside a whole bunch of other smart giving types like stock and crypto and QCDs. So if you're interested, about 1,200 charities of all stripes and sizes we get to work with, and we love it. So it's so fun. Just make a small note in the survey that someone can reach out to you and grab 20 minutes to sort of show you the ropes and show you how other nonprofits do that. All right, so we're going to do questions, but I know some folks tend to drop off for questions. So what I want to tell you is that in 2 weeks, we're going to do a whole session on women redefining philanthropy. We'll focus on planned and major giving. One of the things I learned this morning in our research, which blew my mind, is that in 2030, says a McKinsey study, in 2030, women are going to control 2/3 of wealth in the United States. 2/3. A lot of this is the great wealth transfer. A lot of it is rising incomes among women. But you think about that, and there is no successful plan for fundraising over the next decade that does not center around women. And so, we will look at broad trends, we'll look at data. Obviously, there is great diversity among any gender, and we'll sort of talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. But we will take a look at what the data tells us and what some best practices are as well. So we'd love to have you for that if you're up for it. Michelle asked, when is Make a Will Month? And that is in August. So it's in August. And Marta says, how do we sign up? And please make a note in the survey, and that's how you can sign up. So with that, let's dive into some questions. Amy says, I'm curious how much of the growth in overall giving has to do with the increase in multimillionaires in any change in the tax code. Amy, I think it certainly plays that role, right? We've seen that more and more giving is focused on the top earners, most wealthy folks, and more giving is happening in non-cash assets. So it's sort of a shift of, richer folks being more generous, wealth disparity in the United States, and really smart strategies by nonprofits grabbing more of these non-cash assets that are quite big. And so all of that's factoring into the growth. If other folks have input on what led to the growth from 1981 until now, I would love to see it. I was not in nonprofit fundraising in the early 90s. And so I would love your perspective. Liza asks, will you be able to explain how someone could save up to $5,000 in taxes on stock giving from the anchor point discussion? Yes, Liza. So if you are a wealthy individual, first thing is in your itemizing deductions, you get a full income tax deduction for a charitable gift of appreciated assets that you've held for more than a year. And so if that's a $10,000 gift and you're in the top the top income brackets, top tax brackets, you can be saving about $3,700, $3,800, right? So that's a big deal. Now, certainly, if you're in New York City, if you're in some places with higher taxes and charitable deductions for giving, you layer the state tax on top of that, and that's even more. So now we're into the 4,000s. But the other really important thing, which is why appreciated assets are so much better than giving cash, is you don't pay capital gains taxes on those assets. So if I bought that Amazon stock for $2,000 in 2008, and now it's worth $10,000, made a killing, but I'd owe a lot of taxes on that. And instead I avoid that 23.5% capital gains tax that I would pay. It just never happens because I transfer it instead of selling it. And so I avoid the capital gains taxes and I get a full income tax deduction. So we're really stacking the tax deductions, which is why asset giving is so powerful and why all of the sort of larger philanthropists and the smarter financial advisors are telling people to do this. Great question. Richard says, how do you identify donors with DAFs? Richard, there is no magic list of DAF donors, which is why it is so important that you have it as a giving option all the time, that when you're doing a survey, you ask people to have a DAF. We need to be collecting this data left and right. This is really, really important. You want to have some things on your website as well. Other questions? Is there action with government regulation about getting money out of DAFs to charities? So there are some rumblings of a minimum payout period with DAFs. The important thing to remember is that the DAF payout rate is way higher than community foundations, than private foundations. I mean, it's averaging about 25, 28% per year, which is way higher than these other avenues. And so there may be new legislation on it, but it's unlikely to change behavior because we're actually seeing folks tend to be, money in, money out, right? And so it may be the case. We'd like to see it just to sort of make sure that floor is there, but I have a personal worry that once we set a 5% minimum, that people are going to say, oh, that's what I should be giving. I should be giving that 5% minimum as opposed to the 30%. Okay, a couple questions. Kelly says, if assets in a DAF, so DAFs are often invested, are still in the stock market versus cash, won't the value of DAFs drop with the market? That is true. What we see is a generally more conservative approach with DAF investing than you might have if you're a 25-year-old investing in a much more risk-on environment. And so those DAFs are likely to be in mutual funds. But remember that the market is up 7% this year, and a lot of it's going to be in bonds, and bonds are paying out a ton of money. So I would expect that most assets in DAFs are growing in 2023. But this is a really good question. Mary says, can we show the magic sentence again? So I'll go back to that. Here we go. I'll leave it on screen for you, Mary, while we talk. How much is crypto really impacting nonprofit fundraising? Asked George. George, it is not a huge thing right now. Why is that? It's sort of centered on millennials, younger Gen X, older Gen Z, who are not the philanthropic powerhouses that boomers and older Gen X are. But it's sort of an important way to get some millennials in the door. A lot of folks do have appreciated assets. How much crypto giving is going to happen this year? Somewhere between 500 million and 2 billion, probably. So it's not nothing. These gifts tend to be quite large. So we know of charities that have gotten $1 million or $2 million in a single crypto gift. So I would say you want to be ready, but it's probably not going to be a huge factor. So great question. Matt asks, is there any data on donor acquisition during times of economic uncertainty? Is the general trend of fewer donors giving more dollars consistent or accelerated? Matt, I don't know. I do see participation rates drop a little bit during economic uncertainty. And what it means is likely that you have donors that sort of narrow their giving, right? I used to give to 11, now I'm going to give to 7. Or I'm giving to 7, but I'm not going to go give to 2 more. And so it's a time where maximizing giving from existing donors is probably a better strategy. But if anyone has great research on that, I would love it if you shared it. I'd love to see it. So great question. Yeah, Donna asks, and maybe we'll make this the last question so we can give everyone a little bit of time back. Is there a way to solicit through DAFs for the charity to get on their radar, make clients aware of their charities? Donna, there's 3 categories of DAFs, but we'll talk about 2 right now. One is these large national DAFs like Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard. The second is community foundation DAFs. Now, for the first one, you cannot go to Fidelity and talk about how great you are and then have Fidelity steer their clients to you. Instead, what you do is you say, wow, there's so many DAFs in America right now. Those people must be among my existing donors. Let me go make sure that my existing donors know that they can get through their DAF and know how to do it, right? So that's what you would do there. Now, community foundations are a different story, right? If you are a local Pittsburgh organization and you want to go to the Pittsburgh Community Foundation or whatever it's called there, you might say, hey, what kind of donors, what are donors in your orbit looking to fund? That way I can share opportunities when they come up. And community foundations are more receptive to things like that than your national DAFs. Now, the problem is national DAFs are growing way faster than community foundations. And so your strategy for DAFs is really go find them among your own donors, as opposed to sort of think that there's this mythical society of DAF donors that all meet and trying to get in front of them, right? So that would be our best advice there. All right, well, let's pause there. And as we do, let me just stop that. I just wanted to say, again, thank you for coming. Thank you for helping your organization navigate these uncertain times. Thank you for helping us and each other learn about what you all are doing. We got a lot of cool examples from folks around how they're navigating this and what they do differently during that time. But generally, it's just sort of a joy to learn with you and to share all this with you. And so would love to see you on Thursday. If you're interested and available, I would love to have someone from our team or me walk you through the donor advised funds and what we call the smart giving suite to help with those non-cash assets. And we'd love to see you in 2 weeks as we dive into giving through a gender lens and really interesting data and research around that. And then if you have anything that you need or questions, my email is patrick@freewill.com. I'm on LinkedIn, where I share a bunch of cool stuff that I read about from other folks or from folks on our team. And so always happy to have discussions there as well. Would also recommend going to check out that AI webinar if you missed it. I think people found it fascinating and really cool. And that's probably one of the things that's going to shift philanthropy most dramatically over the next 10 years. I think the big stories are basically AI, donor advised funds, great wealth transfer, and the rise of millennials as like the really big things sort of shaping our sector over the next 12 years. And with that, I will sign off. I hope you all have a wonderful week. I hope the weather here gets as good as it is where the rest of you seem to be. And good luck with those of you who have kids starting baseball seasons. We'll be rooting for you, and we will look to see, we'll look for results and mostly whether or not they're having fun when we get back in 2 weeks. So take care, have a great day, and talk to you all soon.